He stood alone at the edge of the pier, wearing an old navy peacoat and holding a folded piece of paper in his weathered hands. No VIP pass, no dress blues, no family beside him, just a quiet old man near the railing, watching the water like he'd been waiting for something to surface. When he asked to join the official ceremony, they told him those seats were for registered veterans and families. He just nodded and walked away. 3 hours later, the nuclear submarine USS Virginia would breach protocol and surface directly in front of that exact spot, giving him a salute the Navy hadn't authorized, and one no one would ever forget. Welcome to The Last Witness. Before we continue, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe moments like this deserve to be remembered, hit the subscribe button to support the channel. The Naval Memorial Ceremony at Norfolk had drawn hundreds. Active duty personnel, retired officers, Gold Star families, all seated in organized sections behind velvet ropes and ceremonial banners. A Navy band played patriotic hymns while honor guards prepared for the traditional wreath laying. It was Memorial Day weekend, featuring a rare appearance by the USS Virginia, one of the Navy's most advanced nuclear attack submarines. Speeches were prepared. The Admiral's remarks were loaded into the teleprompter. Photographers positioned themselves for the perfect shots. Everything ran with military precision, except for one detail no one had noticed. Near the eastern edge of the pier, beyond the designated seating area, and just before the restricted zone, stood a man no one recognized. He had arrived before sunrise, walking with a slight limp but without assistance. He carried nothing but a small folded paper and wore a faded navy peacoat that had seen better decades. His shoes were polished but worn, his hands steady despite their age, his face unreadable as the morning tide. When he approached the check-in table, he asked a petty officer where the submarine veterans section was located. She scanned her tablet, checked his credentials, and politely informed him those rows were reserved for pre-registered participants only. Without argument, he nodded, stepped aside, and made his way quietly toward the pier's edge. He didn't ask again. He took his position against the harbor railing and stood with his hands clasped behind his back. For over an hour, he didn't move. He didn't take photos, didn't speak to anyone, didn't react to the pageantry around him. He simply stood at attention, eyes fixed on the horizon, like he was scanning for periscopes that would never come. To most observers, he might have looked like a retired dock worker or maybe just an old salt who'd missed too many ceremonies. A few security personnel noticed him, but no one questioned his presence. No one asked his name, except for a young midshipman. The kid was barely 19, crisp in his dress whites, walking the perimeter as part of his duties when he spotted the old man standing alone. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, the angle of his shoulders, caught the midshipman's attention. "Excuse me, sir," the young sailor said respectfully. "Did you serve?" The man smiled faintly without turning around. "A long time ago." "Navy?" "Submarines," the old man said simply. "The silent service." The midshipman's eyes widened slightly. "Which boat, sir?" The old man's gaze remained fixed on the water. "USS Thresher," before she was lost. The words hit the young sailor like a depth charge. The Thresher, lost with all hands in 1963 during deep dive trials. 129 souls lost to the depths. The Navy's greatest peacetime submarine disaster. Before the midshipman could respond, his radio crackled with orders to return to his post. He saluted instinctively, unsure why, and hurried away. But someone else had been listening. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, the ceremony's operations officer, had been monitoring radio traffic from the control tent when she caught fragments of the conversation through an open channel. Something about the Thresher. Something about a survivor. She lowered her headset and looked toward the pier's edge through binoculars. The old man hadn't moved, still standing at the same spot, hands clasped, eyes on the water. But now Chen noticed details she'd missed before. The way he stood, not casual, but at ease. The cut of his peacoat, regulation, not civilian. And something else, barely visible at this distance. A small pin on his lapel that glinted when the morning sun hit it at just the right angle. Chen enhanced the image through her scope's camera function. The pin was worn, nearly colorless from decades of wear, but unmistakable to anyone who knew submarine insignia. Dolphins, the submarine warfare qualification badge, but this one was different. Older, from an era when they were made of real silver and earned through trials that separated boys from sailors. She pulled up the morning's roster of registered participants and cross-referenced it with Navy archives on her tablet. No Thresher survivors were listed for the ceremony. In fact, she realized with growing curiosity, there were very few Thresher survivors, period. The submarine had been lost during trials with mostly Navy personnel and civilian contractors aboard, unless Chen's fingers moved quickly across her tablet, accessing classified historical databases she had clearance for as an operations officer. She searched for Thresher crew transfers, personnel reassignments in the months before the disaster. Most records were routine, but one entry made her breath catch. Petty Officer First Class Robert Dutch Morrison transferred USS Thresher to USS Skipjack, March 1963, medical reassignment following diving accident. Commendation, exceptional sonar expertise and depth charge survival training. The transfer had occurred just 6 weeks before the Thresher's final dive. Chen looked up from her tablet, then back toward the pier. The man was still there, still motionless, still watching the water like he was waiting for his shipmates to surface after 60 years. Meanwhile, 3 miles offshore, the USS Virginia was preparing for its ceremonial approach. The nuclear attack submarine had been submerged since before dawn, running silent and deep, preparing to surface at precisely 1100 hours for the memorial service. Captain David Rodriguez stood in the Virginia's control room, reviewing final approach protocols with his crew. Everything was routine: surface on schedule, maintain position 500 yards from the pier, hold steady for the ceremonial wreath dropping, then submerge and depart. But then his communications officer handed him a message that wasn't in the scheduled traffic. It was marked urgent, personal, and addressed to the Virginia's commanding officer from Lieutenant Commander Chen at the ceremony control. Rodriguez read it twice, then looked at his executive officer. XO, take a look at this. The message was brief. Possible USS Thresher survivor on pier. Senior enlisted. Estimated age 80 plus. Request permission for close approach and honors. The XO raised an eyebrow. Thresher survivor? Sir, there weren't many who... I know, Rodriguez cut him off. He'd studied every major submarine incident in Navy history. The Thresher disaster was required reading at the Naval War College. 129 men lost when the submarine exceeded its crush depth during trials. It had led to complete overhauls of submarine safety protocols. But if someone who'd served aboard that boat was standing on the pier, Rodriguez made a decision that would later require explanation to his superiors. Communications. Send a reply to Lieutenant Commander Chen. Request positive identification of the individual in question. If confirmed, we'll deviate from protocol. Back on the pier, Chen had moved closer to the old man's position. She approached carefully, respectfully, stopping about 10 feet away. Excuse me, sir, she said. I'm Lieutenant Commander Chen, operations officer for today's ceremony. The man turned slowly. Up close, she could see his eyes. Pale blue, weathered by decades, but still sharp. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen the ocean from underneath. Ma'am, he said with a slight nod. Sir, I couldn't help but overhear. You mentioned serving aboard the Thresher? Something shifted in his expression. Not defensive, but careful. Like a man who'd learned to be cautious about sharing certain memories. I did, he said simply. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, how is that possible? The Thresher was lost in 1963 with all hands. The old man, Morrison, Chen now suspected, looked back toward the water. I was transferred off 6 weeks before her final dive. Medical reassignment after a diving accident. He touched his chest unconsciously. Perforated lung. Couldn't handle deep pressure anymore. Chen felt her heart rate increase. This was it. A ghost from one of the Navy's darkest days, standing alone at a memorial ceremony, unable to join the official proceedings. "Sir," she said carefully, "what's your name?" He studied her for a long moment. Then, "Robert Morrison. Dutch to my shipmates." He paused. "The ones who didn't come home." Chen pulled out her radio. "This is Ops to Virginia. Priority message." 3 miles out, Rodriguez received the confirmation. USS Thresher survivor positively identified. Robert Morrison, transferred March 1963, medical. All records verified. The captain stood in his control room, surrounded by state-of-the-art technology that the Thresher's crew could never have imagined. In 60 years, submarine warfare had evolved beyond recognition. Nuclear power, advanced sonar, satellite navigation, computer-controlled systems. But some things never changed. The brotherhood of the depths. The knowledge that every man who goes down might not come back up. "Diving officer," Rodriguez said calmly, "prepare for emergency surface. We're going to pay our respects." "Sir, we're not scheduled to surface for another 40 minutes. Change of plans," the captain said. "We're going to give a sailor the homecoming he's been waiting for." On the pier, the ceremony was proceeding normally. The admiral had taken the podium, naval aviators were preparing for the flyover, and honor guards stood ready with wreaths. But Morrison remained at his solitary post by the railing, still watching the water. That's when someone in the crowd pointed toward the harbor. "Look! Something's coming up." The water began to churn 300 yards from the pier. Not the gentle disturbance of a scheduled surfacing, but the dramatic upheaval of an emergency blow. The crowd turned, murmurs growing to excited voices as a massive black shape began to emerge from the depths. The USS Virginia breached like a whale, water cascading from her hull as she rose to the surface faster than anyone expected. Her sail tower broke the waterline first, followed by her deck, then her full 377-foot length. She was magnificent, a testament to American naval power and technological advancement. But she wasn't surfacing in her assigned position. She was coming up directly in front of the pier, closer than protocol allowed, her bow pointing straight toward the spot where Morrison stood. The ceremony's announcer stumbled over his words. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears the USS Virginia has adjusted her approach." But Morrison knew what was happening. As the submarine settled on the surface, her crew began appearing on deck. Not the usual watch, the entire crew that could fit topside. They formed ranks along the submarine's deck, facing the pier. And then, without any announcement or fanfare, every sailor aboard the Virginia came to attention and rendered a hand salute. Not to the admiral, not to the official platform, but to the old man standing alone at the pier's edge. Morrison stood motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by a tribute he'd never expected. Then slowly, he brought his own weathered hand to his forehead and returned the salute. The entire ceremony had stopped. Hundreds of people turned to see what the submarine crew was saluting. They saw an old man in a peacoat, standing alone, his hand trembling slightly as he held his salute. Someone in the crowd began to applaud. Then, another. Within seconds, the entire pier erupted in sustained applause, not for the pageantry or the technology, but for a sailor who'd carried the weight of survival for 60 years. Morrison held his salute until the Virginia's crew lowered theirs. Then he dropped his hand, placed it over his heart, and mouthed 2 words toward the submarine. "Thank you." Captain Rodriguez, standing on the Virginia's bridge, raised a bullhorn. His voice carried clearly across the water. Fair winds and following seas to the crew of USS Thresher. Still on patrol. The traditional submariner's farewell for boats lost at sea. Morrison's eyes filled with tears he'd held back for decades. As the Virginia prepared to submerge again, Morrison pulled the folded paper from his pocket. The same paper he'd carried to the ceremony. It was a list, handwritten in fading ink. 129 names. His former shipmates. The crew of the Thresher. He held it up toward the submarine, then released it into the harbor breeze. The paper caught the wind, unfolded, and drifted down to the water where it floated for a moment before disappearing beneath the surface. The Virginia submerged as dramatically as she'd appeared, her crew still at attention until the last moment. As her sail disappeared beneath the waves, Morrison stepped back from the railing. Lieutenant Commander Chen approached him. "Sir," she said, "there's a seat reserved for you in the VIP section, if you'd like." Morrison shook his head gently. "Thank you, ma'am, but I've said what I came here to say." He looked once more toward the spot where the Virginia had surfaced. "They know I remember them." He turned and walked slowly toward the pier's entrance. As he passed, sailors and civilians alike stepped aside, many removing their covers in respect. An elderly woman, probably a Gold Star mother, touched his arm gently and whispered, "Thank you for your service." Morrison paused, looked at her with kind eyes, and replied, "Thank you for remembering theirs." He disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a ceremony forever changed by his presence. That evening, the Norfolk Naval Station issued no official statement about the USS Virginia's unauthorized surface maneuver. Captain Rodriguez was quietly commended rather than reprimanded. The Navy understood that some protocols exist to be honored, and some exist to be broken when honor demands it. Every year since, the Memorial Day ceremony at Norfolk includes a moment of silence for the crew of USS Thresher. A single empty chair is placed at the pier's edge, not in the VIP section, but at the spot where Morrison had stood. A brass nameplate on the chair reads simply, "Reserved for the silent service." And every year, when submarines participate in the ceremony, they surface just a little closer to shore than regulations typically allow. No announcer explains why. No deviation is logged in the official records. But if you know where to look, you'll see the crew come to attention, face the pier, and render honors to an empty chair. Because some salutes are returned across decades, and some debts can never be fully repaid. The submarine service calls itself the silent service for a reason. They do their duty in the depths, unseen and unheralded. But sometimes, just sometimes, they surface to remind the world that brotherhood runs deeper than the ocean itself. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever met someone like Dutch Morrison? Someone who carried the weight of survival, who honored the memory of fallen comrades not with words but with decades of quiet remembrance? If you have, share their story in the comments below. Let this space become more than a video. Let it be a memorial where silence speaks louder than speeches. And if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, hit the subscribe button to support the channel, because some legends don't need monuments. Sometimes they just need someone to remember they were there.